Hi, my name is Sarah Nunes, and I'll be presenting on the research question, is traffic fatality rate related to mandatory community service and jail time? If so, how? So here's my table of contents, and I will be covering the introduction, some preliminary answers, a statistical analysis, and my results and conclusions. I'm going to start with the introduction. My hypothesis to my research question is that there will be a significant difference between mean traffic fatality rates across mandatory jail time and across community service. I chose this topic because I have a personal relationship to traffic fatality victims and to alcoholics. I also have a passion to make educated voting choices, and I'm also very interested in the effectiveness of laws. This is relevant to the wider society and the world because one person every 50 minutes dies due to a drunk driving accident. There have been 10,511 drunk driving deaths from 2018, and I believe that it is very important that we learn from the past to see what laws are most effective at reducing traffic-related fatalities. Some things about my data set. I use simple random sampling method in order to bring my dataset from 336 samples to 250, and my variables included JLID, ComCert, MRAL, beer tax, META, PARINC, UNRATE, and VMiles. However, to answer my research question, I'm focusing on mandatory jail time or JLID, mandatory community service or ComCert, and MRAL, which is the traffic fatality rate variable, and it's in deaths per 100,000. And I chose these variables because they pertained most to my question and also yielded the most significant results. So here is a relative frequency of ComCert and JLID, and this is showing the relative frequency bar graphs of mandatory community service and mandatory jail time. I'm focusing on how these variables relate to the traffic fatality rate because they yielded the most significant results in relation to my original question, exploring how drunk driving related laws affected traffic fatality rates. And here you can see that there is a higher frequency of mandatory jail time than mandatory community service. And in general, no community service and no jail time is more frequent for both. Here is some grouped relative frequency bar graphs of ComCert and JLID together. And although I didn't do a statistical test on this, I find it very interesting to look at. As you can see, there's a combination of no community service and no jail time as the most common, and community service is more frequent when jail time is also mandatory. And now I'm going to go into some of my preliminary answers to my research question based on some descriptive statistics. So here is mandatory jail time and traffic fatality rate. You can see a box plot of traffic fatality rate versus mandatory jail time grouped by yes or no on the left. And you can see this does show homostaticity if the outliers were removed. On the right, you can see a side-by-side mean bar plot of mandatory jail time and traffic fatality rate. You can visualize that there is a higher traffic fatality rate mean for yes mandatory jail time than for no. And as you can see, there's most likely a significant difference between yes and no jail time because you cannot draw a line between the error bars, as you can see with this animation. And this will be further assessed later using a t-test. So here are the same graphs shown for mandatory community service and traffic fatality rate. You can see a box plot of traffic fatality rate versus mandatory community service grouped by yes or no on the left. As you can see, this also shows homostaticity if the outliers were removed. On the right, you can see a side-by-side mean bar plot of mandatory community service and traffic fatality rate. You can visualize that there is a higher traffic fatality rate for yes rather than no. And you can see that there's most likely a significant difference between yes and no community service because you cannot draw a line as seen by these error bars again. And this will be further assessed using a t-test. So now this is showing the standard deviation and means of my variables. And you can see in these tables that there's a higher mean fatality rate when there is mandatory jail time than no mandatory jail time. And there's a higher mean fatality rate when there is mandatory community service than no mandatory community service. And this is just confirming what we saw in the bar graphs on the previous slide. And now I'm going to go into a statistical analysis, and I'm going to give some preliminary answers to the research question based on descriptive statistics. So actually, I'm going to be discussing the t-test analysis. And so my claims for this is that for jail time, that there is a significant difference in mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no jail time. And for community service, that there is a significant difference as well in the traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory community service. And this is just based on that I couldn't draw the line between the error bars on the bar graphs earlier. And so here are my null and alternative hypotheses. So for JLID, the null is that there is no significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory jail time, while the alternative is that there is significant difference in the mean traffic fatality rate between yes and no mandatory jail time. And for community service, it is the same exact ones except for community service because I also could not draw the line between the error bars on the bar graphs. And here are my t-test results. So as you can see, the p-values are both below 0.05 or the 5% significance level. And therefore, I said that there is a significant difference. And you can also see that there are a relatively high t-statistic, which also contributes to that there is a significant difference. So my decision based on the t-test for mandatory jail time is that using the 5% significance, we had sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative that there was significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory jail time. And for community service, my decision based on the t-test was using the 5% significance, we had sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative that there was significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory community service. So in conclusion, for jail time, the sample data supports the claim that there was significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no mandatory jail time. And for community service, the sample data supports the claim that there was a significant difference between the mean traffic fatality rate and yes or no community service as well. So a little bit about normality and homoscedasticity. As you can see, the p-values for both mandatory community service and jail time in both tests were all the same. Homoscedasticity is satisfied for both. As you can see, the value for them is both larger than 0.05. Normality is not satisfied according to the Shapiro-Wilks test because one of the p-values is lower than 0.05. However, I'm going to trust these results because the sample size was large enough to account for some normality. And so now I'm going to go into my results and conclusions and talk about the overall conclusions based on descriptive and the t-test, some limitations, future directions, and an overall analysis. So my overall results to my research question is the traffic fatality rate related to mandatory community service and jail time and how. So I concluded that there are higher mean fatality rate when there is mandatory jail time than no mandatory jail time, and there's a higher mean fatality rate when there is mandatory jail time, when there's mandatory community service than no mandatory community service, and this was also confirmed based on some descriptive statistics of mean bar plots and t-tests. And so my analysis is that mandatory jail time and mandatory community service as punishment for drunk driving laws are both correlated to a higher mean traffic fatality rate. A plausible explanation for these results could be that there are areas with higher traffic fatality rates, implement stricter drunk driving punishments, and this would make sense from my research as a large portion of traffic accidents are due to drunk driving. However, there may be other explanations or variables that play a role. Some limitations of my analysis is that this is just a correlation and does not say about causation. So there would be needed further analysis to determine that. And this is a limited data sample. It's also pretty dated as it took place in the 80s and 90s. And it would be interesting to look at how other variables related in conjunction to these. In the future, I want to add more variables in conjunction with the ones analyzed and search for a more recent data set. I would also like to do more research into when and why these laws were implemented. In conclusion, for mandatory jail time and mandatory community service, there is significantly higher mean traffic fatality rate, and this is impactful to the field because it suggests that there's a trend between harsher punishments and higher traffic fatality rate. It is worth investigating whether harsher punishments would actually lead to more accidents or if it agrees more with my plausible explanation that this is just a correlation, that places that already have this high fidelity rate implement a higher and more harsh punishment. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good winter break.